Welcome everyone to our next edition of the Personal Histories and Conflict Resolution interview series. Delighted to have all of you here with me. And I am delighted to have the wonderful Andrea Schneider here to talk about her great chapter in the book, Bashert, How I Found Dispute Resolution and It Found Me. So there's so many things, so many bases for us to touch on, Andrea. So thank you so much for taking the time today. I'm sure everybody knows about Andrea's amazing background in the field. And actually it's included in the chapter that we emailed out to everybody, so I'm sure you read it. But Andrea is currently at Marquette Law School in Wisconsin. And she has been, her career, when I read about your career, Andrea, I'm so jealous. I mean, you were at the program on negotiation at the moment, you know, with Bruce and Roger and Bob Manukin. I mean, it's almost like reading about somebody in old Hollywood, you know, where they were around all the big stars. So I can't wait to ask you lots of questions about that. But first, let me just begin by saying thank you so much for taking the time. It's wonderful to have you here. And I'm super excited about this conversation because I know you're not shy to tell all the good stories.
All the good stories, right? Whatever scoop you need, I'm here for you.
Great, great, excellent. So why don't we, for the people that didn't read the article, just say a word about Bashert. Now, you said it's Yiddish for destiny, so
it's Bashert.
Bashert.
And
okay, Bashert.
But I like the idea of basher, of like, you know, either whether it's one of the what do I want to say, you know, one of the reindeer, it could kind of rhyme, or you know, just bashing also being the way that I think sometimes we have to create our own careers. But Bashert is this idea that often used in romantic relationships of someone who's meant for you, that you find the person and it's beshert, it was meant to be, of you know, that you and your spouse, or that a particular job might be beshert, or you know, some sort of thing of that. It's kind of fate tied with a little bit of faith, right?
I love it.
And faith together kind of it gets you to this position. And so for me, when I was, you know, the chapter came first, and I'm sitting here writing, trying to think about how, you know, I feel both blessed that, as you said, I was at PON at a magical time.
Yeah.
The idea that I overlapped with so many leaders in the field, and I've had the opportunity to work with them is a wonderful bit of timing and fate. And at the same time, you work hard to get those opportunities, and it's not just luck, right? There's more than like happenstance.
Absolutely.
You've got to take advantage of those opportunities and have people trust you with those opportunities.
Yeah, my grandfather always used to say, you know, you got to work really hard so that your destiny can happen to you. You know, it's not like just, okay, well, this is my destiny, so it's all going to happen. So I definitely get that sense of it's fated to happen, but only if you put in all the work to make, you know, your fate occur. So I think that's great. And I actually, it's funny, my wife is Jewish, also from Russia, originally, her family. And I get confused between what's Hebrew and what's Yiddish, you know, and I actually had an Israeli friend, and I said, wow, that guy's got a lot of chutzpah. And he looked at me and said, well, what does that mean? And I always thought that was Hebrew, but no, I guess it's Yiddish.
Nope, that's Yiddish.
So it gets confused as to which is what. So I love that. Bashert, I'm gonna use that. But take us back to that first class. You know, I love the story that you were sort of trying to figure out your schedule. And you thought it was going to be Roger's class, but it actually turned out Bruce was teaching the class. So many of us, we can't have that experience again. What was that like to sit down in that classroom for the first time?
So, you know, it's funny because I really, I don't know about you, I am already at the point where I wish my memory was better than it is. And so I would love to be able to tell you, you know, what the heck I was thinking in my first year of law school. And I have no idea.
Lost to the sands of time.
Class, right? You know, I assume it was well scheduled. I mean, I've thought back. You know, some of my undergraduate work was in public policy and decision making, and those were really the papers that I loved writing as an undergrad, right? Even in my art history class, it was, well, the Medici and art history, right?
Oh, yeah.
Tell me what decision makers are doing with their art collection, or vice versa. And so I think the idea of a negotiation class to look at how people make decisions, that's going to be my guess as to why negotiation versus, fill in the blank, any other elective that was available that spring.
Sure.
Because
sure.
I didn't come to Harvard thinking, I didn't know Roger Fisher, I didn't know about negotiation.
Right.
It wasn't on my radar screen. That, of course, quickly changed. I mean, I took the class and it was...
It rang a bell.
Oh, it was amazing. It just felt home. It just felt like things made sense. And Bruce was an incredible professor. I mean, he really thinks so carefully about pedagogy and how to deliver a class. And you could tell. I mean, it was just this beautifully delivered, really well thought out set of materials that changed my life.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Yeah, and it's interesting. One of the things, I love reading the chapters in the book and seeing sort of the common threads between some of the stories. But one of the things that did leap out to me was your forensics experience. And I feel like a couple of the chapters have that. You were on the national scene for extemporaneous speaking. I mean, and I think, again, that obviously took you to Princeton. You had all these formative experiences at Princeton, all that international travel. So you were primed, again, it's Bashert, to be in that class and have this work say, wow, this ties together a lot of the threads, for me.
Well, and I think that it's funny because I've mostly thought of the forensic experience as setting me up to be a teacher in a way that standing up and talking, whether or not I knew what I was talking about, was really not a barrier. Like, oh, I know how to do that.
Yeah.
But again, that idea of gathering a lot of material, synthesizing it into a story that answers a question, is really what extemporaneous speaking was all about. And for me, grounding it a lot on international policy as well. So right when I took negotiation, although the class was mostly on basic negotiation, it was that international piece of it that originally drew me to Roger. I mean, that is how I became his research assistant. He wasn't writing about negotiation pedagogy or legal negotiations. He was in the midst of international. That was, I think that was his love all along.
Oh yeah, yeah. And talk about that a little bit more. I mean, you worked on his Senate testimony. I mean, he was involved with so many. I mean, I had an opportunity to have dinner with Roger much later, and it was amazing the stories he told about Golda Meir and the Contras and just sweeping in and Kennedy calling him. I mean, what an amazing experience to be on the front lines with somebody like Roger.
Well, it's very funny. There's a line in one of the books that we wrote together, Beyond Machiavelli. There's a line in it that says something to the effect of, when we were in Afghanistan talking to the generals, right? And my brother, upon getting the book, goes, we? Are you kidding me? I'm like, well, we didn't really, right? This was part of the joy of having him talk about, yes, he was talking to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and the Russians, and talking to the Contras and telling stories of running late to the airport in Syria when he was trying to buy weights and like little weights that he loved and collected. And you'd have these just kind of falling out of his mouth as he was telling you, like, all right, well, we're gonna, this is what's due next week, and oh, I got to do this, and oh, by the way, did I ever tell you the story? Blah blah. And you're like, what? And no, well, Cyrus Vance and I were playing tennis, and you're like, wait, I'm sorry, the side man, what? As if it was just normal.
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting too, because I think people talk about Fisher and Urey and getting the yes, and what an essential book that was for the field. But Bruce was like the key player in that. I mean, he really helped to channel a lot of that, and Bruce obviously took that and turned it into his amazing work with triad and negotiation theory. And so I think it's interesting that you were there for all of that. You saw the dynamics between all of them. And then you also saw Bob Mnookin come out to PON sort of in the next generation of leaders as well. So.
Right. I mean, it's funny because I think Bruce as a model of it's not quite the Energizer Bunny, but it is the, more junior colleague who has a little bit more bandwidth and then can say, here's what we need to do in order to get this project done and up and running, whatever it is, right? Whether it was getting TS or some of the courses or trainings or things like that. And that too was a model for me later on. I mean, when I started writing textbooks, I was absolutely the junior partner.
Right.
With Carrie Minkle-Meadow, with Leela and Jean Sternlight. I mean, and I understood quite clearly from having watched Bruce that, there are responsibilities for being the junior partner.
Absolutely.
And that is, they're never waiting for you. You wait for them to finish their work, but your work better be done and on their plate. That evolves over the course of your career, but it was a good model of the responsibility to work with very busy senior people and get things done.
Well, one of the quotes you have in your chapter, which I love, you said, this is one of the things you learned from Roger working with him. You said, this lesson really stuck with me. Settings and applications will change, but good frameworks and theories can be applied across the board and provide insight and support, even for someone who's not an expert in that context. In some ways, this is what a mediator does, providing process expertise regardless of substantive knowledge. And I think that was so true of Roger. I mean, he would jump from one conflict to another. There's no way that you can understand as much as the people on the ground, but that process expertise, people wanted him to come in and play that role. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that.
Sure, and I think it's one of the things that struck him. I mean, he would say this about his classes where by my second year of law school, I was the TA for a class called Coping with International Conflict that became one of our books. And, it would cover different conflicts from around the country or from around the world. We would teach the process and then students would write individual papers. And it would have been one of the classes I would have loved as an undergrad. This was an undergrad class. I've now taught it myself, both at the law school level and at undergrad. It's a joy to teach. It's really fun. Everybody picks their own conflict. But you'd have students going, well, I might have figured out Kashmir, or I've thought about Chile and Peru or whatever. But in the meantime, I'm negotiating so much better with my roommate. Right? Right. And I see that with my law students also, that, I'm going to be working in a negotiation class on, a divorce negotiation or ending a joint venture together or whatever it is. But even while they are learning these processes, these skills are immediately applicable for your roommates, your loved ones, your family, right? The people who you love the most and usually don't bring your best self to.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And the moment that you can have people see that they are using these skills in the contexts that are frankly most important to them.
Right.
And repeat it in their daily lives, I think they're more persuaded that all right, now I can try this out in that context. At the same time, of course, you don't want to be naive in terms of not understanding the context, the culture, the traditions, rituals, all of the things that happen quite differently around the globe and around the country. And pretending that, because I've got this process expertise, I magically can, swoop in and solve your problem.
Right. Well, I remember when I was doing my first graduate work in dispute resolution, I think I read an article by Herb Kelman about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I went home and had a fight with my wife, and maybe I should try some of these things. So I sort of built it into our conversation, and she said, wait a minute, don't try that mediation stuff on me. I see right through you. So, there's a little bit of nuance to it, but I do see it's, peacemaking, conflict resolution, it's one broad discipline, and then there are different application areas. And I like that you drew that out. One of the things that you said about your time at Stanford was you kind of compared it to your time at PON. And obviously, Bill and Roger are famous for getting the yes. That, you can buy it in airport gift stores. You can buy it in Kinko's. They have it on a little wire thing there. But a lot of these big books that were being turned out at Stanford, these were empirical, deep, academic tomes that were kind of impenetrable to the average person. But, academics appreciated the depth of it. So can you, and I, that led you into the amazing work you've done with Chris on the Negotiator's Field Book and the Negotiator's Desk Reference. Amazing. These books, I mean, we're talking, they will hold your desk down should there be an earthquake. I mean, it's amazing how much is in there. So can you talk about that tension a little bit? Accessibility versus.
Sure, it really was striking to me, because I mean, Harvard says it's interdisciplinary. The program on negotiation does have connections with the Kennedy School, the business school, with Tufts, with MIT. And so there were these people running around, right? Like I met Debbie Kolb, I met Larry Susskind, I knew all of them, Howard Rafa, and that was amazing. But it was, everybody kind of had their fiefdoms or silos and got together on occasion. And at Stanford, at the time, what Bob Mnookin was able to craft was really this interdisciplinary group that also wrote together. And I guess that was the key difference, that there was interdisciplinary work going in terms of courses, but not in terms of publications that brought all of these amazing experts together.
Right.
And what Stanford had were these, as you've said, very long, empirically based, wonderful books that nobody read.
Yeah.
Right. So it was,
some people read, but only a few, a handful
only
of
a
people,
few, right.
would penetrate.
And so, early on, it was Kahneman and Tversky. I mean, this was before Kahneman was Kahneman, and we all know him for, for Fast and Slow and Freakonomics and everything else.
Yeah.
These were the early exercises. Lee Ross in psychology. I mean, there were a couple names that were just luminaries in their field, unknown to people in law. And because, at least for that period of time, there wasn't anybody translating that into law, into legal application, or into popular culture.
Sure.
That's where the ideas stayed.
That's interesting. I remember having a conversation with Jared Curran, who I think came up through a lot of the Harvard programs, but then went out to Stanford. And I think there was a whole psychological angle that I think Stanford was open to in a way. I think the PON folks were very kind of practical, hands-on, legal. But so, and then let's talk about your DC chapter, which I think is fascinating. When you taught at GWU's Elliott School of International Affairs and at SAIS, you were also in the orbit of the folks at ICAR and George Mason. I mean, that really must have been very interesting, because the way they think about, think about John Burton and human needs theory and some of that stuff. That's very different than the PON kind of, approach. So what was that like?
So, and as you said, this is the difference between like luck and fate and Beshert and all of this, to be in Washington, DC. And basically, I think Roger called Bill Zartman, like, hey, do you guys do anything? Can you invite her to lunch? She doesn't know anybody, whatever. You're like, all right. And to go to these kind of monthly or every 6-week lunches with Bill Zartman and Sajid Tuval, Bert Spectrum, these people who were really in international relations and thinking about it in a completely different way. And those are relationships, with Bill, in particular with Bill Zartman, that I've kept up for, God, I'm not going to tell you how many years, but a lot of years of since that time. And again, to have that different perspective, right? So I felt like Washington, DC was this yet again eye-opening interdisciplinary opportunity. At the Elliott School, I was in the political science department. So my lunch meetings with my young colleagues were all, their political science view of the Supreme Court or of the development of law. And then I had these lunches with the SAIS folks who, again, had a different take. And so the idea that knowledge comes from a lot of different disciplines, and that nobody has the right answer. And in fact, it's a far more interesting answer when you think about this perspective and this perspective and this perspective, and you understand a little bit about the disciplines, was really something that was just ingrained as I sat there at the beginning, really, even before I started teaching on my own, was to just absorb.
Well, I think your path, I'm completely jealous that you get to visit all of these thought centers of excellence and meet all these people at the sort of the most productive time of their research. I do think there's so many different paths up the conflict resolution mountain. As you say, it is interdisciplinary. You've got the social psychologists with Mort Deutsch in Columbia. You've got obviously Bill Zartman and the ICAR folks. You've got the PON folks. But again, it's all the same challenge of thinking about this problem. Even the game theorists and the economists like Howard Rafa. It's amazing that you knew and met all of these people in your path, and then you ended up at Marquette. So what was the environment like at Marquette when you showed up there? Did they have a conflict resolution program? Was this a hot topic? Oh.
Well, they didn't have a program, but I was lucky to be hired to create a program. I think for many junior faculty, particularly for law school, what if I'd been hired to teach torts and contracts and con law and hadn't been able to land kind of the teaching that I wanted to? I imagine, not that I would have given it up, it would have been much slower, but I was, they wanted someone to teach dispute resolution. They were bringing someone in to teach negotiation.
That's great.
And early on in my career, that meant a teaching load that was, international law, negotiation, dispute resolution,
sure.
Very much in the wheelhouse of what I had done, what I wanted to do, what I was writing. And so that was incredibly supportive, even to the point of, for a while, we took Len Riskin's amazing work from the University of Missouri in integrating dispute resolution, and Marquette let me fly with that for a few years.
Amazing.
Sure, integrate it, knock yourself out. And to have a dean that just said, yes, I trust you, go.
That's great.
Was great.
Well, and I can't talk to anyone in the Midwest about dispute resolution before they say, well, do you know Andrea? Yeah, oh, I do, of course. We all know her. It's amazing the impact you've had there, and how many people have you brought into the field and mentored and gotten started. That's an amazing legacy. But let's talk a little bit about your academic concentrations once you got to Marquette, because that's been a journey as well. One of the things that you mentioned was ethics. I think you kind of inherited that class and you're like, well, okay, this is a little outside my wheelhouse, but you said you ended up learning to love that class. So can you talk a little bit about how you came to that? And obviously ethics is a hot topic within dispute resolution, but you're thinking about ethics more broadly to young lawyers as well. So speak to that for a minute.
Sure. Ethics was, as you said, totally not even landed in my lap, really forced on me. And in part it was taking away international law, which made sense. There was somebody who was focused on international law. And for me, that was really one of those, like, I'd dabble and I'd come back and I'd dabble. And right, you want someone teaching international law that's not dabbling. I get that.
Sure.
And so finding another class, and my associate dean, who was responsible for assigning all of this, he taught ethics, and he had tried earlier in my career. He's like, you're going to love it. I'm like, no, I don't want to do it. Not that I didn't think I was ethical, and not that I loved my own ethics class. I had David Wilkins at Harvard, and he's terrific. And I still quote him in my own teaching. I really enjoyed it. I just didn't want to do it.
Yeah.
And I was wrong. The idea of, there are pieces of it that totally relate to dispute resolution, and it does feel like I'm coming home when I teach that, right? The conflict of interest of, can a mediator also draft the divorce mediation agreement?
Yeah.
Negotiation and lying, right?
Absolutely.
We're teaching that in all of our classes in terms of ethics and deception and fraud and things like that. So there are, conflict of interest in arbitrators, and do you have to tell them that you have financial connections? Or that you've arbitrated the last 50 cases for this company, or, there are pieces of this that are comfortable, but much of it was new. And what I really love about the class is the way that I think if you teach it, if you teach it the way I teach it, you're asking students to think deeply about what kind of person they want to be, and what kind of lawyer they want to be. And you're not teaching a set of rules, because, by the way, the rules are pathetic and low and completely uninspirational.
Well, rules are made to be broken, right? And but ethics are a different ball of wax. I think it's I think in some respects it's the most important conversation we need to be having in this country right now, because there is an element, there's sort of a smell in the air that ethics are for suckers. So yeah.
Right. And yet, in my own work, and I literally was just telling students this yesterday, when I studied lawyers early on in my career, I did a large empirical study of how lawyers negotiate and asked them to rate each other. And out of 89 adjectives in which one lawyer could describe another. So you, Colin, would be negotiating with, Bob here, and you would have said, I think Bob was this, and you rate him on a 5-point scale. And then you were also rating the lawyer with how effective you thought they were on behalf of the client. And out of 89 adjectives, the adjective that was most highly correlated with effectiveness was ethical.
Wow, interesting. Very interesting.
And to convey that message to students that your reputation, the way that other lawyers perceive you, is going to matter in your negotiation outcomes. It's going to matter. I mean, it matters in life. It matters in your ability to get business. It matters in how you deal with colleagues. It will matter with how you negotiate with counterparts. And to have the opportunity to convey that message, not only in negotiation, but what are the choices you're making in what type of firm you go to, in how your work-life balance works or doesn't work.
Right.
In all of those things, ethics, I think, is a wonderful platform for really thinking about professionalism and what you want out of life.
Well, I want to revisit this when we get to the Q&A too, because I think this is so important, not only for a wider society, but for the dispute resolution field in particular, but also the connection between ethics and trust. But let me touch on another academic focus of yours, and your banner is already giving me the reminder. Women in negotiation, and of course I read Debbie Kolb back in the day, and it seemed new to me. Like you said, I just had a presumption, well, everybody negotiates the same way, there's no real difference. Now obviously we're in an era of lean in, and people talking about this all the time, and you've become, I think, the premier voice talking about this subject. But tell me how you came to it. I love the stories about your grandmother and how they negotiated back in the old country, sort of as the origins of this. But just talk about how you came to this and how this work's been rewarding for you.
Sure. Whenever we talk about gender and negotiation, I tend to point out that much of my research comes from a place of anger. And I don't know that that's healthy, but that is the motivating.
Anger is an energy, and it's okay. Right. Yeah.
It absolutely motivates me to dive back in, even when I think I'm done, whatever that means. So this started, as you say, I took negotiation right back in the day. This was 1990, and we had maybe 2/3 of the way of the course. We had a day, diversity day or gender day or differences or whatever it was called. And we had a video on how women negotiate. And I think Debbie was probably involved in it in one way or another, as I recall. But I was watching this going, you gotta be kidding me. Like, what? This is terrible. Like, why, how, where is, what is this based on? And just kind of under protest listening to this. And in part, it was very much at the time talking about how women need to be more assertive, women need to be more like men in the field. And as I joke, and I continually joke, there was no man in my family, no husband, no brother, no father, no son, whoever said, oh, if only the women in our family were more assertive. That's what's missing, right? It's not a thing in my family. We're loudmouth leaders from the get-go. That was absolutely encouraged all the way. And so, part of this also struck me as to, are you sure you actually want me to be more assertive? What? And I don't know that that's great advice all the time. And also, isn't there something else out there? And why do I have to be like a guy? That's also not my aspirational goal.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Like I like me, thank you very much. And it kind of percolated there in the background. But once I got tenure and kind of did the official law review article to prove that you can, write 100 pages with 500 footnotes that demonstrate that the War of 1812 did actually happen in 1812. saying that's how footnotes tend to be. I did this study on the lawyers, and one of the motivating factors was to redo at least pieces of what Jerry Williams had done in 76.
Right.
So in 1976, Jerry Williams had done a study of lawyers in Phoenix and Denver, looking at negotiation styles, and there weren't even enough women to draw any conclusions. And I figured at least 25 years later, there would be. And there were. And so what I found is that there were no differences that were statistically significant. 89 adjectives, there were four adjectives that had statistically significant differences between men and women, which is what you would expect no matter what the adjectives were, right? On any study, there would be some level of statistical difference. Didn't find anything that really stood out.
Right.
And there was no difference in effectiveness rating, no difference in style grouping and more true problem solving or more adversarial. Just didn't find it. So that was, 2001, 2002, I wrote up those findings, I published it, and I said, okay, I'm done with gender. See, I've proved no differences, and I'm continuing on my merry way to do other things. And then Lean In was published, and Women Don't Ask, and they both came out at around the same time. And it seemed to have this narrative that the problem is with women not asking and that are not leaning in, and that the gender inequity and the pay gap was therefore women's fault for not negotiating. And again, to me, that sounded just like garbage. It's like that just can't possibly be true.
Yeah.
And it's definitely not what Sheryl Sandberg ever meant her book to be taken as of a woman. And Linda Babcock, who wrote the Women Don't Ask, actually then wrote another book, did more studies on this. And, yes, women don't ask at age 22 for their first job with limited information in competitive situations, or in labs, again, limited information, competitive situations, not repeat play. And what we've now found, 20 years out or 15 years out in the research is that there is absolutely no difference in the likelihood to negotiate. That as soon as you get to repeated interactions and equal information and equal access to networking, transparent salary, those differences evaporate.
And one of the things that you write, which I think is very powerful, you say, it's also made me realize that negotiation skills cannot remedy everything. Early articles would blame pay inequity on women for not negotiating harder, for example, but we know that such structural inequities cannot be fixed by negotiation alone. And I definitely see this in the younger generation. I feel like at least in my generation, I maybe generously can say our generation, there was a faith that everything we could sit down at the table, we can work these things out, right? We can negotiate these things. We can find a resolution, the two of us. But now I think there's a greater understanding of these structural inequities that undergird these negotiations. And now there's this sense of we have to address the structural inequity before we're going to sit down at the table. And I think that's refreshing in a sense, to take the broader lens. And maybe, you played a role in articulating that.
I hope so. I mean, I think about, I negotiated all of my maternity leaves. There was no maternity leave policy.
Wow.
That was fine. I can negotiate. I had a great dean and totally supportive. But what if I didn't? And what if I wasn't a negotiation professor?
Yeah.
And what if, I wasn't worried about my job? I was tenured by the time I was negotiating at least the third maternity leave. So, part of this is, why is anybody negotiating that?
Yeah, that's
Why isn't that an automatic decision? Why would we put women in the position of having to negotiate? Our courthouse, for example, used to have women individually negotiate when you needed a break in order to pump your breast milk because you were breastfeeding.
Right.
That is ridiculous.
Yeah.
We should never be putting individual women in a position of negotiating with individual judges on individual court cases, how often they need to do this.
Well, and that's a broader criticism of dispute resolution, is it individualizes disputes. Oh, you have an issue? Well, let's negotiate it and find a resolution. Why should every person that has that issue have to, the burden should be on them to use their personal power and negotiating skills to find redress. We should find a way to address this more structurally. So that's fascinating. So we want to revisit that too. The last thing that I want to talk about before we open it up for Q&A is the interesting work you've done in the criminal context with some of the restorative work. And you mentioned the amazing Janine Geske and some of the work that she's done in Wisconsin, but talk about that a little bit, because I do think that seems to have a real resonance for me that's strengthened over time, this connection between restorative practice and conflict resolution. So talk about how you came into that and what you're thinking about now.
Well, about 3 or 4 years after I joined the faculty at Marquette, Janine, who had been sitting on the Wisconsin Supreme Court, stepped down and rejoined the Marquette faculty. She'd been a clinical professor before joining the court, and years later came back to Marquette and was on her own interested in restorative justice and got us, the Marquette community, involved in restorative justice in the state of Wisconsin. And so for this really was somewhere between luck and Beshert, because it wasn't something that I had brought to the table. I was a happy participant of following along and learning from her, going on prison visits, which is, kind of the first time one visits a max security prison is mind-blowing. And even after a few times through, you're like, this is crazy land.
Wow.
It's amazing, and it's really important work. And so seeing through her eyes those connections, Mark Umbright would come to Marquette and regularly teach and work with us. And so again, having this opportunity of working with people. And I should also say the city of Milwaukee early on was one of the first cities to have a prosecutor who was devoted to restorative justice.
Wow.
And so to have the city on board, the state on board, our school, we really had this locus of people who were focused on it. And that allowed us to move the needle in a variety of ways. And so later, as restorative justice was then progressing, to expand that out to other criminal work, thinking about problem-solving courts, or thinking about how we train for plea bargaining, it kind of became one single platform that we could think about alternative criminal processes and what are we suggesting to the system.
Well, it is very interesting. I mean, the criminal justice system is so broken. And I think, again, when we talk about some of these structural inequities in the system, I think a lot of people, we didn't have awareness of what those inequities were. And maybe one of the things, that our current age is doing is it's exposing some of those inequities. And I think restorative practice can go a long way to giving us a more humane way to envision that. So, all right, I could talk to you for the rest of the day, but we're running out of time here for me to natter on. So I want to open it up to our attendees here. Does anybody have any questions they would like to put to Andrea? You can either put it in the chat, or you can just unmute your mic or put up your phone, and then I'll call on you. There are a couple other things that I wanted to ask about. I know your travels were really important to you in an early stage, Andrea, and it seems that international frame has been something that's really stuck with you. You set up these trips for law students, and so I was just wondering, how do you keep? I mean, you have a local focus in terms of the work you're doing in Wisconsin and in Milwaukee, but then you also have this global focus, and I was wondering how does that, in terms of where you want to devote your time and energy, whatever remaining years you have, how do you reconcile that conflict?
Do I have to reconcile?
No, I don't. Maybe you can have it all. I don't know, but is that
why pick? But it's definitely something. Even I'm in the midst of trying to figure out whether we can pull off a spring break trip this year, which is right. Who knows? I think the international travel bug hit me even earlier than my negotiation bug. And so the opportunity to merge both of them and to expose students to international conflicts is something, as you said, it's definitely been near and dear.
Sure.
I think part of this goes toward one of the things that makes dispute resolution so compelling is this kind of experiential learning that we all have had as we've learned ourselves to be neutrals or build on our negotiation skills as we've engaged in disputes and then seen and felt how people feel when things are resolved or at least managed in a more effective manner. And I think in some ways seeing that those international perspectives has also been really eye-opening, because for some people, much in the same way that we would see, like, I'm learning about Kashmir and I'm translating it to my roommates, I think the opposite can also happen, that sometimes it's actually easier for people to think about, what would I do in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Can I bring that home to Milwaukee, which is really segregated, and think about bringing those communities together? Where if we started with the question, how do we get people in the room? That's really hard.
Yeah. Well, you write about, you were taught from your lawyer grandfather, you were taught early on that curiosity and humility will lead to taking pleasure in a life of learning. And I think that's one thing that travel can really do for us, is it makes us curious and it makes us humble, because we may have a frame for seeing the world. And then when you travel and you realize there are many other paradigms, there's so many different ways to live your life. I think that's a foundational lesson, not only for lawyers, but for mediators, just for people. I know there's an article in the New York Times or the Washington Post today about urging Americans to be better tourists.
Yep, I saw that too.
Yeah, and I thought that resonates with me, that curiosity and humility, maybe that's also part of travel, is that it can open that door. So, yeah.
I think so.
Okay, well, let's go to the questions here. Let's start with Chuck. Chuck says, one question for Andrea. Do you see DR going, and where do you see DR going and needing to go? So I guess that's sort of an open question about the future. Where do you think we're headed?
Oh, it's a good question, Chuck. I wish I had the crystal ball. I think, I think there are a variety of paths, and I feel like we have the power, we in one way or another, to determine that. I think there are paths in which it becomes far more lawyered up in some ways, and that kind of adversarial court-connected mediation continues to evolve in ways that highlight the adversarial part of that rather than the bringing people together. And that I think there may well be the risk that we end up almost dividing up in the field of who's doing more community mediation and facilitative mediation and who's really doing shuttle diplomacy. And parties are not seeing each other, they're not having conversations with one another. And it's not to say that that's not a service, right? If I'm rear-ended and I'm negotiating with the insurance company, I actually don't need necessarily to become friends with the person who rear-ended me.
Sure.
Right? We're good. But I think making sure that clients understand their choices and are not just being directed into processes that are more convenient for their lawyers, that remains a concern. So I think that is one thing to think about. I think the opportunity to think about dispute system design is very exciting. And I look at that in two ways. One is, how do we think about systems and that fairness, that structural fairness, that justice, that if we were to start over, how would the criminal legal system look? Why are we having individuals plea bargain with, no information, no discovery? Maybe they're represented, maybe they're not. What? Right? That I'm not saying, I know it is not the only cause of mass incarceration, but it sure as heck hasn't helped.
Sure, sure.
Right, and so thinking about that on one avenue, I also think the online systems that you and others have worked on offer real opportunities for rethinking how we want to be handling common disputes between people, and can we do that better? And when we've modeled it better in a consumer dispute online or in a tax dispute online, can we bring those lessons into our legal system and learn from those in a more what I want to say, cyclical way?
Yeah. Those are great. Great thoughts. I do think that the dispute systems design folks, they really got ODR early. Bob Bordone wrote about this even before I got involved in the field. He was talking about, wow, this technology may help us make these systems designs more real. And obviously Jan and Lisa and Stephanie, their book is great, and it's embraced ODR from inception. But one of the things you said that resonates with me, and this is a paranoia I have as a non-lawyer mediator in the field, I do feel like the lawyers are taking more and more of the energy. And, we see like ACR and NCPCR and Spider and some of these organizations kind of losing a little bit of steam, but the dispute resolution section is still going strong. And I think that they have a very legal orientation. When we talk about all these different paths up the mountain, are we putting a legal frame on dispute resolution? And what I worry about is that's going to lock us into a certain way of thinking about the way these systems have to work, where, oh, you have to file your case, you have to collect evidence, you have to, and it's like, that's not necessarily the way that all these disputes get resolved, as you said. And there is innovation within the legal community, but sometimes I know when we do mediation trainings with lawyers, the lawyers often joke, okay, I gotta get out of the lawyer mindset, and sometimes they even describe themselves as reformed lawyers, or, so it's interesting you name that. I'm interested in hearing what other people think about that dynamic in the field as well. Okay, I'm talking too much. Risa has a question. Is there a guide to requirements for practicing mediation in different states in the US? Maybe you could talk about that also in the Wisconsin context. Is there, there isn't, yeah, please.
No. I mean, I think their court systems have different certification programs, right? What might make the Milwaukee County courts happy to hire you as a divorce mediator in Milwaukee is not necessarily what, the state of Virginia is going to use for civil litigation. And so you need to check on court programs and so on and so forth. But the question of certification and requirements is one that has circulated through the field, well, ever since we've had a field.
Yeah, that's right. Although we did make progress with the Uniform Mediation Act and things like that. I think you can talk about mediation in all 50 states and people will say, oh, okay, I know you're not talking about meditation. But I do think that we still have a long way to go before we've got, common across all 50 states, how that's treated. Okay, Claire asked a great question. Claire, do you want to, I could read it, but Claire could say it as well. I'll read it. Claire said she's interested in how you frame your women in negotiation teachings when we need to support gender fluidity and not be gender restrictive, while at the same time teaching about gender norms and identity.
Absolutely, Claire. I think it's really important. And I, when I'm giving talks on women in negotiation, start with all sorts of caveats, because I look at and talk about the research that's presented, which sometimes is talking about biological differences, and we'll do, we'll look at gender through that lens. Sometimes we're talking about socialized differences. And so how are people, right, socialized, however they present themselves, right? Nobody's asking or testing. It's a question of, are you presenting as a gender or not, in which how you come across and how you are received is in some ways up to you, and can be absolutely fluid. And the fact of the matter is that there's also no studies that I've seen, although I'm always looking for them, so I'd be happy if talking about sexuality and choices in that way as well. So we know what we know, and we don't know what we don't know. Which limits the information. And so part of this, and I should also say that I don't give trainings that say, here's what women need to do. Or frankly, I would say that here's what anybody needs to do. Any of our skills are on a bell curve. So I don't know when I'm talking to somebody else where you are on that bell curve. I spend a lot of time talking about that our negotiation habits and approaches and assumptions may come from our gender and how we were socialized, but it could just as easily come from our birth order. It could come from our family dynamic as to where were you a lot of kids grabbing for all the food at the same time or not. It could come from our professional training, which law might have one impact, but engineers or architects or however you were trained. And it can come from the region of the country you were in or what country you were in, because we know that ethnicity and regions also have their assumptions about communication and how you come across. I talked about this in class last week, the expression, bless your heart, if you're down in the South, right? If you're from the North, bless your heart sounds like a really lovely, kind thing for somebody to say to you. And if you're from the South, it's actually telling you that you're a moron. So to say, right? Like, so we have all of these assumptions. Right, so true. Thanks, Claire. Right, bless your heart. No, and I don't know when I'm talking to you where you are on any of those. So I think the more that we understand negotiation assumptions and our behaviors to be fluid in and of themselves, of coming from a variety of places, I wouldn't, and I don't tie it to say that gender is determinative in any way, shape, or form. I mean, maybe it was for you, but it might not be for the person with whom you were negotiating. And so that fluidity, I think, needs to be embraced, right? It could be part of how you come across or not at all.
Well, it is interesting. Again, we talked about, please, helpful. Claire.
Thanks, Claire.
I think we talked about how please, Claire, what were you going to say?
I was only saying thank you. That was helpful.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, we talked about the younger generation and the way they think about things differently than the older generation. I think, my kids who are both in college, they really see gender as a construct. They see it as a question almost. It's like there's a spectrum, and just like they see race as a construct. There's no clear, bright lines in any of this. And I think the way that we talk in dispute resolution about culture is a little bit more nuanced. There's overlapping circles, and it's not like there's a bright line. You're in this culture, you're in that culture. Someone can be in both cultures and understand, both the northern approach to bless your heart and the southern approach to bless your heart. So maybe we need to start to think that way about all these dynamics instead of being so binary about it. Let me mute.
Right. I think that's actually really, I think that's really helpful for us to understand that those are overlapping constructs. And I talk, my youngest is a junior at the University of Wisconsin. And if you were negotiating with him, right, is he negotiating that way because he's a frat boy, God bless him, because he is the youngest of 3 boys. And if he didn't talk faster, jump higher, and, grab food off the table, he wasn't getting fed. Does he negotiate that way because he's the son of 2 lawyers? Does he negotiate that way because he's a Midwesterner? I don't know.
The answer is yes.
And frankly, neither do you.
Yeah, all of those things.
Yes.
The answer is yes. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
And we talk about, people think about, well, there's French culture and there's American culture, but we also have rich, poor culture. We have, right. There's religious cultures, there's political cultures. All of these things overlap. We're the product of every one of these forces. So each one of us is unique in that sense. So yeah, I love it. Well, Bob asked a great question too. How will the current approach to dispute resolution design handle the Gen Z phono-sapien generation, where communication has primarily focused on text messaging and social networking?
Bob, I think you're so right. And the pandemic has thrown this into even clearer array of understanding how technology has impacted this. So talking about social intuition and our cues that we have, right? 4 years ago, I would never have suggested a video negotiation as a really tenable option. You do it if you need to, and FaceTime is cute for talking to your friends, but who would actually conduct it that way? Or that plea bargaining would actually be done through text messages. That sounds, to me, so unprofessional. You've got to be kidding me. And yet we know that's what's happening. And so really understanding, I guess, first, different generational assumptions about technology, and then the pros and cons of each of the technologies. My advice, and I've spent some time writing about this as well in the Negotiator's Desk reference, and really thinking about the modes of communication and the choices that we have to make those choices, to make sure that we're not automatically defaulting, that we in our generation is not defaulting to, I would just as soon email you, or if you're not showing up to see me in person, I'm going to take that as disrespectful. And for, again, talking to our law students or kids or whomever, of, you could pick up the phone. I understand there's this wild technology out there that allows you to both hear at the same time, right? And to really think about, when are you calling, when are you texting, when are you emailing, when are you doing it face to face? There are emails great for conveying a lot of information. It's wonderful, but you're gonna, what happens when you're reading your email on the soccer field and you've like answered point 1, and you haven't even pulled up on your little mini screen that there's like points 3 and 4 and 5. Maybe that's not the best way to communicate, and you need to call somebody to tell them to actually read the end of the email. Right? Yeah. We've got to be more adept all around. I think intergenerationally and with ourselves. There's a lot of opportunity to use technology wisely. But that also gives us opportunity to be really dumb.
Well, yeah, and new norms are emerging. I mean, like, how long do you wait after responding to a text? There's how many rom-coms are about. How long do you wait? Is it 1 day? Is it 2 days? There's a whole elaborate dance. But I think there are also some people that if they're going to put an aggressive offer in a negotiation on the table, some people prefer to do that over text because they don't want to have to get in a situation where their hand is shaking when they, hand the piece of paper over. So it's interesting.
Right.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time. There's a quote that I'd love for you to read, if you wouldn't mind, Andrea, because I love it so much. The bottom of page 229 in the book, the paragraph that starts the study of dispute resolution.
Okay, so you want me to read this?
Yeah, can you read that? Because I like it so much. Just that paragraph.
And the entire paragraph?
Yeah, come on.
Okay, all right.
Please.
All right, everybody, here you go. So the study of dispute resolution, and I truly believe this, the study of dispute resolution has given me a home for my interest in other people and places. It gave me frameworks and theories to structure my curiosity and understand why and how these concepts could be useful. I probably would not have been so compelled to work, teach, and write in this field unless something in it resonated with me in some innate, profound way. And the colleagues in my field, my mentors, co-authors, co-bloggers, and friends, are like the soulmates that Beshert implies.
That gets me. I feel like you're speaking for a lot of us, but I think this community is what holds us in. I think the practice, this shared practice, is so interesting. When I went to my first mediator conference and I looked around, I'm like, oh, I want to be like these people. And I think that's kind of what you're speaking to,
Yeah.
and maybe that's kind of what drew you in. So I don't know if you have any final thoughts around that. I mean, you mentioned about creating your community too, like creating indisputably. That's a very powerful thing. But how much has the community meant to you that you've been able to be a part of and also build?
On the day-to-day existence, these are the best people in the world, and it's been a joy to work with everybody and then continue to expand it, and to know that, oh, if you're at this conference or you're a friend of Colin's, right, you're going to be interesting and part of my tribe, as it were, and
part of my culture.
Wonderful. Part of my culture, exactly.
Well, Andrea, I want to thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I could just talk to you all day and all night. But please, if everyone could join me in giving Andrea a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time with us. And thank you for all the great work you're doing in the field. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for joining. Please join us next week for our conversation with Nicholas Lozada about ODR in Colombia. But have a great rest of your day and be well.